Welcome to the Mind Vine podcast, where we challenge the stigma associated with mental illness through conversations about a variety of issues impacting mental health. Here we bring you news, views, and interviews that intrigue, educate, and celebrate recovery. Leading us on this journey are the hosts of the Mind Vine podcast, Darryl Mathers and Chris Bovie.
We're talking Bell Let's Talk, and this is actually our 50th Mind Vine podcast. We were talking the other day that we weren't sure we would get 4 done at one point, and that was a couple years ago, and this is our 50th. And we're pleased to welcome our audience. We have an audience for this one. I'm Darryl Mathers. I have my co-host Chris Bovie, and we have a very special guest today in advance of Bell Let's Talk Day, but this will be published on January 30th when kind of the country pays attention collectively to mental health. But pleased to welcome Kelly Scanlan, everybody. We got an audience, might as well clap. So, as you can tell by her uniform, Kelly is a firefighter, previously military veteran, Invictus Games participant, among other things. Really appreciate you being here. And we're going to talk about your story, which is quite broad. You even talk about, even as a child, maybe you can talk a bit about your family, because I know being a first responder is something that's quite common in your family.
It is, yeah. I grew up in a first responder family, and when you talk about a first responder family, a lot of people think like maybe a mom or a dad, aunt or uncle here and there. I think we're up to, so the family I grew up in is my mom and my dad were both police officers. I had 5 cousins who were police officers and 3 uncles who were firefighters. And now that I've grown up, I'm a firefighter. My sister's a police officer. I've got another cousin who's a police officer. And then I was also in the military. So that was a uniform job as well. We got a few military people kind of dotted throughout. So the family, I think we're up to 10 or 11 of us spread across the board in different agencies.
Was there any doubt in your mind when you were growing up what you wanted to do? Was it just clear, just judging by looking at a family picture, that you were going to be a first responder of some sort? It
wasn't always clear. I think police officer, because that's what I mostly grew up around, was the predominant view in my head that I would one day be a police officer. But just like any kid, I had 1,000 different things I wanted to do. I think when I was in grade 5, I wanted to be like an archaeologist, and somewhere along the way you want to be like a marine biologist, and 1,000 different things you think of. Honestly, firefighter was never on my radar until I became an adult, until later in my life. And the military I also hadn't thought of when I was younger. It wasn't until I was in my teens and the military was kind of presented to me that was a direction I started to go in. So first responder was always something sitting in my head, but it was never really finalized until my adult life.
So what was it like growing up in a first responder family? Was the conversation about things that happened during the day, was that something that was presented, or did they sort of keep the job separate and family life separate?
I don't think me and my siblings were ever truly separate from the police life, because not only were my parents both police officers, but that meant, and then the rest of my extended family were police officers, but that also meant that all of our friends were police officers as well. Like everyone I grew up around was from the policing community. So no matter what, we were never really separated from that. A majority of the people in our lives were from the policing community or from the first responder community. I think my parents, they didn't dump us into it right away as young kids, but as you grow up, you definitely kind of hear what the environment is like and what the atmosphere is like, because especially when we'd have family dinners, that was the talk. It'd be all the police officers who all work for different police forces kind of sharing their stories and comparing the way they did things versus the way another police force did things. So that was something we always grew up hearing around the dinner table for sure.
We were actually just talking about this morning, but it's a common topic when we talk about young people kind of choosing careers, and the fact that they change careers so often, or there's a great anticipation that they will change careers so often. Mm-hmm. And even when they're in high school, being pushed to a stream and kind of deciding what direction they want to go at a very young age, and how difficult a choice that is for some young people. But for you kind of, we talked last week, and you mentioned, I think it was a career fair or something that happened, and you were quite young and you had made up your mind on what you wanted to do.
Yeah, so I ended up in the military when I was 16, and that decision was made around the time I was 14, because anyone from the Mississauga area, they have the Streetsville Bread and Honey Festival, and one day the military set up a booth there. I'd never seen them before. I kind of just started talking to them, and they laid out this whole plan where you can join the military at 16 with parental consent, and that just stuck with me right from, because I'd never thought about it before. Military was never on my radar before that moment, but that always kind of just stuck with me as something that seemed really interesting to do and something I thought I might want to do. So pretty much as soon as I turned 16 and I had my parents behind me, I put my paperwork in, and a couple months later I was starting my training with the military.
Wow, and it wasn't too long after that you had your first tour in Afghanistan. So can you tell us a little bit about leading up to that and then making that first tour of duty? Yeah,
of course. So I joined the Army when you're 16. They still do have the rules, like you can't deploy until you're 18, but you can start doing the training really young. So I trained with the military, and I actually did part of my training through my high school. They had a co-op program, and so instead of going to high school, I earned high school credits by serving with the military. So I did that for a couple of years, turned 18, and put in my name right away to go overseas because we were in the middle of the war in Afghanistan. That was in 2009, and got selected and went and we did training for, I think it was around 8 months. You train, and different people with different skill sets have to train for different amount of times, but we trained for several months. And then in 2010, about a month after I turned 19, deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months.
And we were talking that you're not sure exactly how the youngest person to go on a tour was, but you'd guess that you were among the youngest females to ever go on a tour of Afghanistan.
There were definitely 18-year-olds. I never ran into another 18-year-old female who had deployed. As a 19-year-old female, I'll definitely be one of Canada's youngest female veterans to deploy for sure. Like, I can't say the youngest, don't want to claim that because I have no actual idea. There might have been an 18-year-old, but at 19, definitely one of the youngest for sure.
Your family must have been proud, but they must have been pretty anxious about you going at such a young age.
Yeah, they've always been that uniformed environment, so they were super proud when I did this and very supportive of me going. But of course, once I think it really hit my parents in the last couple of weeks before I left, that they were like, "Oh my God, like what are we doing?" Like, if you talk to my mom, she talks about the last time they dropped me off at the base before I was going to fly out. She talks about looking at my dad and being like, What have we done? What have we agreed to? Mm-hmm. What is going to happen here? And then, of course, my poor mom, when I went overseas, it was always her. Whenever I'd call home, she was always the one on the phone when something would go wrong, like the base would get rocketed or we'd get attacked, and I have to be like, "Bye, Mom, love you." And poor her, it was always her every time. So I had to make a few calls back and always reassure that everything was okay, everything was fine. But yeah, I think a few gray hairs definitely came over that 8 months for her.
And it was, I guess, before you actually deployed is when you suffered an injury.
Yeah.
And then, so take us through that, because I know it was a physical injury at the beginning, and you obviously dealt with some adversity while you were on your tour. And just talk about maybe how that kind of morphed into the struggles post-tour.
Of course. So where my story of everything kind of going sideways started is I was trained to go to Afghanistan when I was 18. And during the training, I was involved in a training accident that is not uncommon. It's not even an interesting story in any way, shape, or form. Like, there's injuries in the military all the time. It's just part of the industry, part of the game. So I had an injury and went and saw a few doctors about it. And as is pretty common, they were like, "No, you'll take a few weeks off, let it heal, you'll be fine, no problem." And after that few weeks, it didn't get better. And I kept seeing doctors, and they kept saying, like, it'll get better, it'll be fine. And it just never did. And we were hitting this point where with this injury, if it didn't get better, I wasn't going to go. And I really did. I still wanted to deploy. I still really did want to go. And I was also 18. You don't really understand taking care of yourself. You're very keen on just pushing through and making things happen. So eventually I just stopped bringing it up and kind of just pushed through the pain while we were doing the training, which was okay at the beginning. But then I went to Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan, the injury just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where when I came home, I went and saw a doctor again, and finally this person was like, I don't know who told you were fine. I don't know who said that everything was going to be okay, but you needed to be in surgery 2 years ago. Like, you never should, if you didn't want this to get worse, you never should have been over there with this. So I ended up having to go in for surgery and do a long time of trying to do physiotherapy and see osteopaths and see all different kinds of doctors to get it healed. But what had happened was, turns out I had completely torn the ligaments and tendons in my right leg, like fully severed, and no one really picked up on that. And then when you did 16 months of first pre-deployment training and then a tour in Afghanistan, the injury spread up into my knee, into my hip, into my spine, all the way up into my right arm. So the entire right side of my body suffered damage because of that. And after I came home, they said this is an injury that happens very rarely. It especially happens very rarely for people your age. So doctors weren't really sure how they were going to address it, how they were going to fix this without making it just worse in the long run.
Yeah, when we first heard the story and you told me about that, I thought, to push through, that must have been excruciating for you. Like to just the pain from it, but knowing with a complete tear and being able to do anything with the willpower to do that, it must have been tough.
It was tough, especially I'll say by the end of my tour, like it was very painful at the end. But again, you're young, and the Army is a world where we all kind of know that there's always a bit of suffering involved. So I definitely wasn't the only person who ever had these aches and pains, and you kind of just learn that that's just kind of the way it is. That's just the environment. So we ended up just pushing through. You end up just getting the job done because the mission is what matters, and that's just the way it is, kind of.
So when you're back home and you're dealing with these physical issues, at what point did you start to struggle with your mental health?
So I think I started struggling while I was overseas. Like, I started having anxiety and I started having nightmares. But when you are overseas, like when you're in Afghanistan, that's kind of, again, just considered par for the course. Like, that's just part of the whole atmosphere. It's considered normal. Like, you are definitely not the only one who has that happening. So no one really brings it up. It's not a big deal. And when you go home, you kind of have this idea in your head that that's all just going to go away eventually. For your first year home, I think a lot of people, I know I was, is definitely focused on the reintegration part. You're focused on reintegrating with your family and your community and getting used to being home again. So for the first year, a lot of this stuff just gets pushed into the background. So I'll say it was around a year, maybe a year and a half after I'd been home, that I really started to notice that something wasn't right. And it was because I had days, it started off small, it started off just as 1 or 2 days here or there, but I had days where I just felt down, just felt tired, just depressed for no reason. Like, nothing had happened. There was no reason to be upset in any way, shape, or form, but I just felt that way. Problems with my sleep, nightmares, and insomnia, and this all kind of started rolling together. And eventually I had to take a step back and be like, okay, something is not normal here. It's not normal to feel this way without some kind of cause and effect. Like, you have the effect, but you don't have whatever the cause is. So eventually I went in for an annual medical with the military, and every time you go in, they do a mental health questionnaire. And this time I just answered really honestly about everything that was going on, and they picked up on that right away and pulled me in to talk with a mental health expert. And he was the one who, after a couple sessions of talking with him, decided that he said I was suffering from depression and anxiety and PTSD. And from there, now at this time, it was a hard time because here I am, I'm 20 around this time. I had this physical injury that was causing me chronic pain, and now I also had the mental health stuff that was dragging me down. So everything was pretty much going wrong all at the same time.
And the future that you kind of had picked out at such a young age, was you were losing a grip on that as well, right?
Yeah, I was losing a grip on a lot of things, because between the physical injury and the fact that doctors didn't think I was going to recover, and then the mental health stuff, like I had always had this plan that I would stay with the military, and then when I was done with the military, I'd follow my parents' footsteps and go become a police officer. And I still remember doctors sitting there and being like, that's just not a realistic goal for you anymore. And they said, I think it's time for you to reassess the direction you think your life is going to be able to go in, because they said you're never going to be able to run again. You're going to have to leave the military. You are not going to be capable of doing the job anymore. Policing is just not an environment that you're going to be able to function in. Like, it's time for you to start looking for something that's basically going to sit you at the desk for the rest of your life, and that'll be that.
And it's hard for the general public to understand what it's like to go on a tour of duty and come back, or a first responder. How did you find your family of first responders when you were dealing with this? You know, having that same perspective, knowing how tough it is in the field, you know, did you find that to be something you could lean on a bit more than a friend in the general population?
Oh yeah, my family, particularly my parents, were my rock through this whole situation, because these struggles, both physically and mentally, I'll say pretty much ate up my entire life for around 6 years. 6 years of struggling and 6 years of things just getting worse and never getting better, and everything kind of just feeling like it was constantly falling apart. And my parents were the rock that held me down when I felt like I was just going to fly away. They supported me, and even when they didn't understand, like, they were always checking on me, always with me, always doing whatever they thought they could. And I know, talking to my parents now, they had a lot of moments where they were like, we had no idea what we were doing. We just hoped that we were supporting me the best way they could. But they did other things too. Like, my mom went and took courses on mental health. She went and did research on mental health. They used their job to access people who had experience with this and talk with them and kind of get that insight so that they could help me the best way they knew possible. And like, I give them all the credit in the world for me being kind of where I am today, because they were the ones that made sure that in that 6 year time frame where everything was pretty much going wrong, they made sure I knew that there was going to be something the next day, something to look forward to.
And one of the key pieces in that kind of next step in your life was the Invictus Games.
Yep.
And for people who don't know, that's the event created by Prince Harry for veterans who have both physical and mental injuries. And it was held here in Toronto
in 2017.
Yeah. And tell us a bit about how you got connected to the Invictus Games and what that experience meant.
Yeah, so what ended up happening there was I really hit a down point in my life, and I remember sitting and thinking, because I was in my early 20s, which are supposed to be like the best years of your life, and instead they were just some of the worst, and kind of wondering, like, what is the point of all of this? But like I said, my parents were really kind of keeping me on track, so I ended up making this decision that if I couldn't have a happy life, I would try and have an interesting one. So at least I'd have some kind of story to look back on and think like, oh, that was cool that I did that. So I started getting involved in things, started traveling, I went back to school. Like, I did a ton of different stuff, kind of looking for whatever would be the wake-up call. And in that whole process, I was introduced to the concept of the Invictus Games by another injured soldier that I was friends with. And he explained the whole thing. He said, yeah, it's like the Olympics or like the Paralympics, but everyone who competes is a soldier who was injured during their time serving with their respective militaries. So I put my name in to compete for Team Canada. Never been an athlete before that, never had any athletic background, and really just thinking that if this actually happened, it would be a cool story. Like, that would be a cool story. That'd be something cool to be involved in. So I put my name in, and before I even knew I was on the team, before I even got accepted on Team Canada, I started thinking, okay, like, the Invictus Games is this big international event. People from all over the world are watching. The prince is there, all these world leaders come out. And I started thinking, like, man, it would be really, especially because when we were hosting in Canada, I was like, it'll be really embarrassing if I go and do these events and I like suck at it, if I disgrace the country by doing really poorly. So before I even knew whether I was part of the team, I started to train, which automatically kind of pushed me in directions I'd never gone before. Like, I had a really tight group of people. I kept the same people in that time period, but none of my friends knew how to do competitive cycling or competitive swimming or competitive anything. So I had to go out of my comfort zone and find groups of people who were already involved in these sporting communities and learn from them. And I started training, and I trained for a couple months. And after a couple months, I kind of had this moment where I realized I felt better physically. Like, the training in the early days was really difficult. It was really painful in the early days. But after a couple of months of training, realized that physically I felt better. The pain I was in was reduced. Parts of my body that usually had chronic pain were reducing or either going away altogether. And mentally I felt better too. Like, if I got up in the morning and I had a really good workout, I felt lighter. I felt much more upbeat for the rest of the day. I was sleeping better. I was feeling better. I was more positive about stuff. And kind of just started to have this realization that they may have had something here, something I'd never thought to use before. I never thought to use sport before as an avenue to get better. And it changed everything for me. And I don't use this phrase lightly, but it really was life-changing, because I trained for several months, ended up making the team, finding out I was part of Team Canada, and overall my whole training went for 16 months. And in that 16 months, my life completely flipped around from what I thought it would be to where I am now. They opened my eyes to the fact that it didn't always have to be this miserable, broken down life, that I could have a new future again, that all these doors I'd closed about my future suddenly were open to me again.
So you basically you had purpose again. You had a goal to achieve. And so I guess during that time were you at this point starting to think about the prognosis from your doctors, like, I think I can do more. Like, I think I can revisit going into first responder or career.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what happened. Is I trained, I think by this point I've been training for about 6 months, really started to see the changes, and an opportunity came out. I live in the town of Milton, and the town of Milton Fire Department opened up a hiring. They were hiring part-time firefighters, and that was something a couple years ago I had really closed the door on. Like, that was just never going to happen. That was never going to be something I could ever do. But I decided, like, hey, let's see if I can do this. So I put in my application, went through the whole process, the whole testing, and ended up getting hired by them. And I remember having a moment where I was kind of like, what am I doing? Like, can I do this? And I trained with the Milton Fire Department as a new recruit concurrently with my training for the Invictus Games. And every day I'd have that moment waiting for that other shoe to drop, waiting for that moment of, you can't do this, like, time to back it up and get out of here. But it just never came. Instead, things got better and better and better. I got physically better, I got mentally better, which the two of them just fed off each other. Like, the fact that I had a new uniform and a new team and a new purpose was fed off the fact that I had this goal at the end of Invictus. So the two of them just fed into this great positive feedback system, when before my mental and physical injuries were constantly just feeding each other to create this negative atmosphere. Now I had the fire department and I had Invictus feeding a positive one instead.
When you were preparing for the Invictus Games, you were approached to share your story and all the elements of it, both the physical and mental health components of it. And I wonder, like, well, take us through maybe your thought process. You've already, you were down here, you were really struggling, and you got to heights that you weren't sure you'd ever reach again. Mm-hmm. And then they come to you with this opportunity where you have to kind of open everything up and be transparent. And I wonder how that, how did you make that decision to be so open and honest about your story?
So by this point in time, like, everyone knew that I was part of the Invictus Games, but everyone assumed that it was just related to the physical injuries, right? They had no idea that there was any mental health stuff involved in it. They always were just assuming it was because of the physical injuries that I'd suffered from. And I don't know why. Oh, I know why they picked me. I was going to say, I don't know why they picked me, but I guess I do. Is the story of me being able to use the Invictus Games to go and become a firefighter when I thought that was just never going to happen. I think a lot of people kind of started seeing as this really, like, nice success story, this really good success story. So people from the Invictus Games reached out to me and asked me if I would mind coming and telling my story about what had happened to me before and how I got involved in Invictus and what Invictus kind of meant for me. And I don't know why I agreed. Honestly, I don't know why I said yes, because I didn't feel ready at that point. Like, I didn't feel like I was ready, because no one knew about the mental health stuff. Like, my parents knew and a few close friends, but the wider range of people, like, no one knew that this was going on. I think they all just thought it was a little mental. But I said yes, and I remember sitting down and trying to write out my story, write out what happened. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I was up for 48 hours just sitting in front of a computer trying to type it all out, and I realized, like, there's just too much to this story. There's just too much going on. I can't put it down on paper. So I didn't have anything written down. I didn't have anything prepared. I got on the train to go down to Toronto to meet with all these media people, and I remember sitting on the train and just being like, I'm going to cry. This is it. Like, I'm just going to fall apart. This is the worst thing I've ever done. And just thinking I was absolutely crazy, and just like panicking over the idea that this was going to happen, because once it was out there, like, once that story was out, there was no taking it back. There was no hiding all of this again. There was no putting it back in the dark. And somehow I just got up in front of everybody. To this day, I have no idea what I said. I don't remember what I talked about. I don't remember how the story went at all. I just remember talking until I saw people start checking watches. And I was like, I've probably been talking for way too long. And I'm going to just stop now. And something in that story connected with people, because once that was done, I started to have people reach out who wanted me to come and talk to their media outlet specifically, or come and talk to this group, or come and share my story here, or they wanted to come to Milton and they wanted to see me with the fire department. And it just boomed from there. And in the early days, because I had seen it as a negative, that once the story was out there, it was out. There was no taking it back. There was no pretending like it had never happened. But it ended up being really freeing in the end, because once I told my story, there was no pretending like it had happened. There was no having to pretend for other people. They all knew it, and I couldn't pretend like it hadn't happened, which actually made it really nice to not have to hide that part of what was going on. And so my first couple of times talking publicly was about me, was about how I felt about that whole situation. And then later, when I started doing public speaking, it changed over to, once I was in a good place and once I was really feeling like I had kind of healed, it became about sharing my story and hoping that it sparked something in someone else, that they could kind of see that I had used sport, but that didn't mean, and maybe sport would work for someone else, but there's so many different alternative therapy types that can help someone who may be struggling. And I thought maybe this story can just inspire someone that if whatever they're doing right now isn't working for them, go and find something unexpected, something you would have never tried before. Like, I never would have picked sport before. I was never involved in competitive sport as a kid, never really cared for sport as a younger person, and somehow I used it to change my whole life.
In sharing your story, I mean, often people are afraid of the unknown and what will happen once I share that story, because they see the way it's portrayed. And then often they'll share their story and be surprised by the support and love that comes back. What do you think we can do, and maybe this ties to Belle, is to change that, to feel like people can share their story? What can we do in society to make it more open for people to feel free to relieve this burden that's on them, that they're hiding often?
It's kind of really hard to say what the number one thing we could do. Like, the really easy answer is that we have to eliminate the stigma around mental health, but that's a lot easier said than done. Like, how do you do that? I think the best way to do it would be right now through education. I realized that when I was struggling, I went and learned a ton, either through talking to doctors or doing research online. I learned a ton about mental health, about my own mental health, about the science behind it and the research into it and the research into the different recoveries and therapies. And that really helped me kind of understand what was going on with myself, but then it also really helped me understand what was going on with other people. And that allowed me that when I was confronted with these people who kind of carried that stigma it allowed me to look at them and not really take on what they were saying, because I knew the science behind why this was happening. I knew what the experts were saying about it, and I knew, looking at that person, I'm like, you don't know anything about what you're talking about. People have this really bad habit where they seem to think they know anything about any of it, and maybe some of you guys are mental health experts, but none of us are doctors. Like, none of us have done any research into this. No one knows the science before, like, why this happens, but then they all feel like they got to make a comment about it. So I think education for both the people who are struggling, so that they understand what's going on inside their own head, and then for people outside of that to start looking at this the same way we look at physical injuries. Like, there's a lot of things I compare these situations to. I talk about how mental health is kind of like ligaments and tendon injuries before we had the scanners that could see that. And back in the old days, people would be like, oh, my leg really hurts. And they look at them and they're like, there's nothing wrong with your leg. I don't know why you're saying your leg hurts. We realize now, using science and using different medical advances, that we can look under the skin and we can see what's wrong with it. But we're sitting at that point right now where we don't have the technology to see exactly what is going on in everybody's brain, but that's being worked on, that's being invented, that's being created. We're just at that early day where people don't have that science in front of them yet. And then a lot of people want to complain and kind of go on about why do some people suffer and other people don't. And when I talk to firefighters, so in firefighters, we are statistically much more likely to suffer from cancer than anybody else. And I use cancer as an example, not because the two illnesses are anything the same, but just the way that it happens to people is some people have cancer because they've got things in their genetics, or they were exposed to something that caused it. And I use the example where people will say, like, if we had a brand new person join the fire department and a guy who'd been on for 20 years, and they both went into the same fire, and the new guy came out and had cancer, no one would look at him and be like, well, he's brand new. Like, what is he saying he's got cancer for? That's nonsense. Or if two people went into a fire and one person came out and they say they had the same amount of time in, and one person came out and had cancer, no one would be like, oh, they've been through the exact same thing. That guy doesn't have cancer. Why do you have cancer? Mm-hmm. You just need to switch the phrase cancer with mental health. If two people go into a situation and one's okay and one isn't, no one should be like, well, that person doesn't have a mental health issue. Why do you have a mental health issue? It just doesn't work like that. Different people are affected for different reasons. Different people suffer from different severities. And we just kind of need to accept the fact that we have to start looking at it the same way we look at physical injuries.
You have a great quote talking about the severity of people's mental health issues that I saw as part of your work with the Bell Let's Talk campaign, where you equate, you talk about an experience where people coming up to you and saying, you know, I'm really inspired by what you've gone through, and I've had similar experiences, but it doesn't compare to what you've been through. Can you just talk about that experience a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll say the quote you're thinking about. The quote that I put out with Bell Let's Talk that really seems to resonate with people is, I said, people drown in oceans, and people drown in pools, and people drown in bathtubs, and people have to stop worrying so much about how much water they're drowning in and just remember that you're drowning. Drowning is drowning either way. And the way that saying came into being was I would go and talk about my story. And afterwards, I would always have people approach me and they would say, like, I've struggled, or a family member or someone I know has struggled. And because my story came from a military background, they'd always be like, oh, but it's like nothing like what you went through. And after hearing that exact same phrase 4, 5, 6 times, I realized it drove me crazy. It drove me crazy to hear it, because it seemed to create this system of one mental health issue being more valid than another mental health issue, or that, well, that person went through something horrible and you only went through something that was really bad. We shouldn't have to worry about you at all. It doesn't work like that. Like, if we're constantly comparing and playing the game of comparing each other's stories, we're never going to get anybody fixed, because there's always going to be that one person who just had a way worse story. And then we're just going to end up fixing whoever that person is, and everyone else will just have to have to pretend like nothing's wrong. It doesn't work like that. People need to accept that an issue, like a problem is a problem. If you're drowning, you're drowning. You need air no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're drowning in 2 inches of water or 200 meters of water. Like, you're going to die if you don't breathe again. And that's just, not to sound really dramatic when I say that, but everyone needs air.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the stigma that we put on ourselves as society. Like, there is a stigma out there, but we feel like we don't, like, to your point, that what reason do we have to complain or to seek help when you see what other people are going through? So I think it's not just what society puts on us, but also ourselves. Yeah.
For sure.
And you mentioned just before we kind of wrap things up, your work now as a firefighter. You started in Milton, you're now full-time in Mississauga. Yeah. And the fact that you're so public about your own past with mental health and your physical injuries, and you were able to overcome that and start a career, I think speaks to how far our society has come. That maybe beforehand you would have been maybe highlighted as somebody to avoid, right?
Yeah,
and
as a no-go.
Yeah, and can you speak just a little bit about the reception you've gotten in your professional community, or the support you've gotten from your fire departments that you've been involved with?
Yeah, of course. Both Milton and Mississauga have been extremely supportive. Like, I got very lucky because I'm sure there are departments out there that maybe aren't as supportive about it, but Milton, because I was with them when the story went public, and they were probably who I was most worried about when I told this story. I was like, what are they going to think that they have me as their firefighter, and the stories come out? But right from day one, the chief and all my fellow firefighters were really supportive of me. They supported me through my whole training with the Invictus Games, and I think it's because I was able to show them that I can do this job. Like, I had been out on the road doing it. I'd never faltered when they needed me, and they took that. They trusted me that I knew myself and I knew what was going on with me to be able to do this job. And they worked with me about their own learning and developing their own mental health awareness programs. And then when I moved over to Mississauga, I got really lucky. Mississauga is a department that they're already known for their mental health program. They have a wellness and fitness initiative, which is all about firefighter physical and mental health prior to an injury. So they have a committee who's just dedicated to doing everything they can to keep firefighters in as best condition as they can before something happens. And then they have a great peer support team they've won awards from different organizations for their peer support. So I got really lucky. When I came into this, they were already organized in that. They were already kind of part of the department's leading the mental health charge in the firefighter industry, and I just got drawn in right away. They knew my story. They knew exactly what they were kind of getting with me, and instead of that ever being a concern for them, instead they've been very supportive. And when I was doing Bell Let's Talk and doing things like this, they were like, yep, go forth, tell the story, share it, and hopefully the day will come when our peer support teams will only be needed for little things here and there instead of the mass amount of issues that we're starting or that we've always had and are only just starting to address now. But yeah, both my departments have been fantastic. And sometimes you get people, I haven't had anybody say anything from either of the departments I've worked with. I've definitely had people make comments from outside of that. But like I said, I know myself and I know what I'm dealing with and what I'm capable of, and so I just don't listen to those people anymore. I know that they don't know me and they don't know what they're talking about. So they're easy to ignore.
So as we mentioned, you're part of the Bell Let's Talk campaign for this year. Bell Let's Talk Day is January 30th, but you'll be busy after that as well. People can see you at different events. How can they keep in touch with you on social media?
The only public social media I have right now is a Twitter. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe my handle is KCC_Scanlan. And I'm kind of just in and out talking about the different things I've done, or if I'm going to be at an event, that's where they can follow it, or where they can reach me if they're so inclined.
And lastly, just like on January 30th, everybody is encouraged to get on social media, on their phones, on text, with the hashtag Bell Let's Talk, and Bell will donate 5 cents for every interaction. I know it's been a big, not only fundraising initiative, but just conversation starter for the last number of years that Bell has done this. It's gotten the whole country talking about mental health for at least one day. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate you being so honest and taking time to join us, and we'll keep tabs on your future in advocacy, and look forward to maybe catching up down the road.
Yeah, and who knows where I'll end up. So maybe I'll be back for your 100th.
Yeah, well, good.
That's what you said it for.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah.